Cannabis Common Sense, the show that tells the truth about marijuana and the politics behind its prohibition.
Welcome to another exciting edition of Cannabis Common Sense. We have a fascinating interview this evening with Michael Krawitz in Virginia, who's a member of many different organizations. I'll let him outline those momentarily. But first, let's bring on our infamous dancing cannabis leaf.
I feel the force.
If you are a loved one or looking for help finding a medical marijuana doctor anywhere in the United States, we have a referral service. So call us at THCF. It's 503-235-4606. That's 503-235-4606. And without further ado, here's our interview this. Okay, I would like to introduce back on our show Michael Krawitz in Virginia. Michael is on many different organizations, boards, and he's worked to change international law with the Cannabis Embassy and the Veterans Action Council. What other DRC? What is DRC? Is it the list is DRC Net, right?
Yeah, so I have quite a few hats. Under the work that we do under the flag of ending extrajudicial killings in the Philippines, and we even try to work on ending, murder of cannabis users who are caught in Malaysia, etc. That's done under DRC Net Foundation, Stop the Drug War, and I'm on the board of DRC Net. And then in the United States, working on cannabis appellations and the sort of the future of cannabis policy, sort of visionary stuff for after cannabis is legalized, basically at the national level. This will become a lot more important, cannabis appellations and cannabis genetic resources, protections and stuff. And this is done under a organization out in California based called the Origins Council. And I'm on the board of the Origins Council. Working internationally at the World Health Organization and the United Nations in Vienna, we do it under several different banners, actually. And some of the work was done under my group individually, the Veterans for Medical Cannabis Access. Some of it was done under FAT, which is the Foundation for Alternatives for Addiction Treatment and Think and Do Tank out of Paris. Also, we worked a lot with ANCOD, the European NGO Coordinating Network out of Vienna and out of Brussels. And under different patient coalition entity under Americans for Safe Access, that was called the IMCPC, the International Medical Cannabis Patient Coalition. That was active, actually, very active, right at the beginning of our work in Geneva back in 2015 at the World Health Organization. And then later picked up by the IACM, the International Association for Cannabinoid Medicine Patient Coalition. The IMCPC dissolved, and the new patient coalition under the International Association for Cannabinoid Medicine picked up from there. At this point, now we're working inside the United States on rescheduling, and leading that effort has been Veterans Action Council. And we've been engaging with the DEA and the courts on various levels. I think at this point we got like 30 media articles about our work in that regard.
Well, let's talk about that rescheduling. It's my opinion that the powers that be, the corporations and the others are not going to allow that to happen. What do you think?
Well, that's always been sort of a mantra, hasn't it, in our cannabis movement, a belief, a strong belief that working every day against us was big corporate powers and pharmaceutical interests. So that's not a new belief, Paul. And I think it's always been somewhat supported by fact. Otherwise, it wouldn't have stuck around this long. There's always been evidence, like when GW Pharmaceuticals hired Andrea Barthwell to represent them, for example, for a while. Andrea Barthwell being one of the top drug warriors in the country, representing a cannabis interest that's trying to legalize cannabis for pharmaceutical companies. That doesn't really engender our, strong sense of belonging and support. So yeah, I get it. But in day-to-day real world, ironically enough, we're responsible. We, being the cannabis movement ourselves, is responsible for this delay. We, again, in a broad sense, the cannabis movement, in this case, a couple of very sharp attorneys, Shane Pennington and Matt, what's Matt's last name? I can't remember. Matt, I apologize for forgetting spacing your last name. That happens when you're trying to talk and remember a bunch of things at once. But anyway, Matt and Shane are very easily found on the internet, talking about the cases, and you probably have on the subreddits and things like that. They've got a log of everything that's happened under this DEA rescheduling action, and probably the best source of information about that, from that kind of a perspective, where it's logging every single issue and every court filing and stuff like that. Of course, got to give kudos out to Marijuana Moment. It's done a really good job of picking up the highlighted stories. They've talked a lot about Veterans Action Council as well in our efforts. But right now, we were in an administrative hearing where we were listening. We, in the big sense, the United States was listening to the folks that had come forward and registered some sort of a problem or issue that they would have, making them a legally interested party or affected party to this rescheduling that was recommended to be Schedule 3, move cannabis from Schedule 1 to Schedule 3. The recommendation, of course, came from the highest levels of the Health and Human Services and the FDA, concurred to by the administration and the DEA leadership. Seemingly, the administrator wasn't signed on to this. And there was this little, sort of, I don't know what you call it, a sub-drama, mini-drama on the side, where the administrator of the DEA had communication with our long friend, Kevin Sabet, the standard bearer of the opposition to marijuana, opposition to all things legalization. Kevin Sabet steps forward and on his Twitter feed or whatever says that he had communications with the administrator, who told her before that she was not going to sign this rescheduling action, that she was going to make the Attorney General sign it. And sure enough, the Attorney General signed it, which evidently, I don't follow these things as closely, but evidently was somewhat unprecedented. I don't think it matters. The Attorney General has that responsibility, and the administrator has delegated that responsibility. To my mind, I could care less who signed it between the two. But the fact that Kevin Sabet was talking with the administrator, they divulged him this internal controversy that she was having with signing it, and that she was going to have the Attorney General himself sign it, would be herself now, but it was himself then, sign it. It's quite interesting, and interesting to the court, evidently. Not so interesting to the court, evidently, as other filings that they also found of other communications. Evidently, there was some communications between a certain state police troop and the court and the administrator that they have found as well. So there may have been some, sort of smoking guns to side conversations that were less than appropriate in this action. And those keen attorneys that I was just talking about earlier, every time I say Matt in my brain, I come up with Matt Southwell from the INPU, the International Network of People Who Use Drugs, and it's blocking my access to Matt's last name still to this moment. I haven't given up on it. But yeah, Matt and Shane are in appeals court right now, United States Court of Appeals, which is a different court, because the administrative court was inside the DEA itself, their own administrative law judge. And outside in the real world, now in the U.S. Court of Appeals, the highest court, I guess, under the U.S. Court, Supreme Court, is now hearing this case, and it's on their docket, and they're discussing it. I don't know what the hearing schedule is. I'm not really following that closely, but they're presenting a case. Again, Shane and Matt and those guys are presenting a case that this is all very inappropriate. They want to get to the bottom of it. They want to see if there's, they want to do subpoenas and, get some records and, use the power of the court to do further investigation to figure out if the administrator is trying to derail this. And I commend that, but, you take a lot of heat for that. And the folks that are actually the plaintiffs in this, one of them is of which is a veterans group, which is generally their leadership are part of Veterans Action Council. It's you take a lot of heat and a lot of misinformation out there, that the industry is trying to stop the hearings, or that somehow the big corporate powers have some other interest. But no, that's all it is. It's our movement generally that's slowing down the process, and it may be with good cause. And since that whole case that I just described happened, another group, doctors group, also friends of Veterans Action Council, doctors group called the Doctors for Drug Policy Reform, has joined suit and also went to the U.S. Court of Appeals, going after this list, this participants list. Because this is the last thing I'll say about it. It's so complicated, but this is a little piece that I think is really important to understand. To go in as a, again, interested party or affected party by this proposed Schedule 3, you had to present to the court, or in this case to the DEA, who was accepting these pleadings. You had to make a pleading to them that you would be somehow injured by that proposed Schedule 3, and you would recommend some alternative, or you would have some idea of what would alleviate your injury. Those would be generally the two components of that standing argument that you would be making to the DEA. The DEA was supposed to consider those things when they created a list from that larger group of people that sent them letters to present to the administrative law judge for review. And the best I can tell, and again shortening this whole thing, but the best I can tell is the DEA really didn't do that. What they did was they looked at the group of people that sent them letters, and they tried to pick a robust, kind of well-rounded group. So, some drug warriors, some anti-drug warriors, marijuana supporters, anti-supporters, whatever. That's what the list looked like to me. But that's not what their job was. And what that wound up doing was it created an end participant list of only people with standing or against marijuana. Not a single group, one standing, who is in favor of marijuana. And that's specifically because of the way that the DEA selected those participants. I'd go into a little more detail if you want. This is already so long to explain. I didn't want to make it longer.
Well, it doesn't surprise me that the DEA has opposed it. And I'd read that Kevin Sabet was going to fight it in the courts every step of the way with lots of financial backing. What do you think the outcome will be?
Well, first of all, before I leave that last point, I got to really, sort of, celebrate, if you will, the fact that this is completely unprecedented. We've been in this process. Again, we, the marijuana movement, started the petition process against the schedule of marijuana the day after they scheduled it. 1971, Normal put in a petition, and in like 1978, 79, they hit pay dirt, and they were winning, and they got shot down. And then in 88, they were winning, and they got shot down. And each and every time they got shot down, it was like the judge, the administrative law judge, was on our side. The facts and evidence were on our side, but everybody else was against us. The DEA, the HHS, the FDA, the NIDA, everybody was against us every step of the way. The only thing that was on our side from 1971 to now was the evidence and the judge who, rules on the evidence. And that we found out in 1988 that the judge wasn't enough. The judge put down a stern ruling, and the DEA took his own judge to court. Yeah. And they won. They won a ruling in 1988 saying that the DEA administrative law judge was only one component of the decision-making process that the administration could take when making a scheduling decision, and that there are other components to that decision, like protecting the children or whatever, that they could apply. But now we are here where the HHS, all right, so the president of the United States, that was Biden at the time, got on TV and said, hey, this is wrong. You know, the schedule of cannabis is wrong. I ran on that. Look into that, Attorney General. Figure out what's going on, and look at the states. Look at the experience of the states. And that was primarily the biggest single difference to the initiating of this process. Was first, we had the presidential administration on our side for the first time. I mean, even Jimmy Carter never tried to reschedule cannabis. I don't know why, but nobody has ever been on our side in the administration. So tick one off to celebrate. Administration on our side. Yeah. Then they give it to the Attorney General with the mandate to look at the states. Now, we legalized, again, you know, our big marijuana movement legalized medical cannabis back in 1996. And this is only like a year or two ago that this happened in 2024 or whatever, 2023. I forget the exact moment he made that announcement on TV. And you're looking at a big difference to, 1996 to 2023. That's how many years we, again, the marijuana movement, worked in the states perfecting our art and creating a body of evidence. The FDA looked at some 6 million patient files connected to some 30,000 doctors. And even that was just a scan. That was just a few states that they looked at. There wasn't an exhaustive review of what we've done in the states on medical marijuana. And what they came to the conclusion of was that cannabis is has accepted medical use. Their opinion of their job under the law, under our Controlled Substances Act, the FDA was always the one to determine if it had accepted medical value in that Controlled Substances Act. And they determined that it did, based on the evidence that they were looking at, that they had never been able to look at before. So there we had an established legal precedent of medical value to cannabis that we never had before. And the FDA on our side, and then connected the HHS on our side. And then comes the DEA, where that's really a quizzer. I don't even know how to process this, but the DEA administration is on our side. The DEA administration, set up the whole thing and put forth the recommendation. They're on our side. There was the administrator that was opposing the DEA administration. And I don't even know what that means. You might be better qualified to talk to that than I am. So anyway, I just wanted to finish that by saying that, how unprecedented that all is, and why this moment is so very different. So why, and I think that'll help you understand the shorter answer, which is the direct answer to your last question. What do I think is going to happen? Cannabis will be rescheduled. It will take a while, but it will be rescheduled. The process is ongoing. It's written into law very securely. There's nobody in Congress contemplating changing that aspect of the law. Even if we were to deschedule cannabis, the whole process of evidence collecting and scheduling for medicine would still continue. Descheduling cannabis would not deschedule cannabis, I guess is what I'm saying. I never said that before. I've never even thought that before, but as I'm talking to you, I just realized something, that if we deschedule cannabis as a plant material and as a drug, as a recreational thing, as a medical cannabis for the states, I don't think that's going to affect our FDA process. I don't see how it could affect the FDA process. And the FDA process is connected to the scheduling of drugs, generally speaking. So if you have a scheduled drug that's cannabis that has a certain schedule that's in the pharmacy, like Marinol, like Epidiolex, and like probably not too far future Sativex and others, many others, hopefully, where do they live? How are they handled? Because the scheduling dictates how the pharmacy system handles them. And Schedule 3 is very different from Schedule 5. That was our argument, Veterans Action Council, that, yeah, it's cool that you would, recommend Schedule 3. We appreciate the hard work, but why not recommend Schedule 5? It seems more appropriate. It matches what we're doing in the states. They look at the experience of the states with regard to the outcome with the patient, but they never, and I can assure you this is true, they never looked at the outcome in the states with regard to the legislation. Like, they never actually looked at the experience of the states in regulating marijuana. And I think if you went to any state and asked them a couple of questions about marijuana, you find very quickly we've resolved ourselves to over-the-counter access to cannabis. You show your ID at the counter and you purchase your cannabis as an adult, or you have some medical reason that you would allow you to be registered as a patient and have an exemption to that age requirement. That's how we do it in the States. That's Schedule 5. That's not Schedule 3. So they're making a mistake, in our opinion, by making a Schedule 3. And one of the victims of that mistake are the military veterans. Because right now, we can't get cannabis at the VA, obviously, and we can't even get the doctor to recommend it because they're sworn off of that because of Schedule 1. Well, once it's out of Schedule 1, they'll be able to recommend it. So we'll be able to get our documentation from the doctor. But they still won't be able to, quote, handle it. And they wouldn't be able to handle it either way, Schedule 3 or Schedule 5, but at least Schedule 5, they can let us handle it. See, it's over the counter. We can handle it. So they can give us some money. They can give us a voucher to get the money, and then we can get the money and go buy it. And they actually, there's a precedent for this. There's a clothing allowance, you know, for somebody, picture somebody with one leg and they need special clothing or whatever. You can go get allowance and they figure out how much clothing you'll need. And they give you an allowance, which you then use to go buy clothing. There's no medical clothing that you get by prescription. You get an allowance and you buy it. And that's how we would want to do it with cannabis. And I think we could almost seamlessly do it. If they would only go to Schedule 5 instead of Schedule 3, we could almost seamlessly do it. Schedule 3 is still going to be a problem. It's going to be a tale of two cities. You know, the VA doctor will recommend it, and then the patient, will have to figure it out on their own. There won't be that connectivity that we could have, what we call, coordination or the integration of the treatment care. And if you as somebody, that has had to deal with medical issues over the years, integrating and having the doctors talk to each other is incredibly important to getting a good outcome. So that's what we wanted with Schedule 5. So I firmly believe that we will get rescheduling. I don't think the arguments, I don't want to not talk about the opposition, but they're generally all in one boat. They oppose Schedule 3. They say it's going to be horrible. The arguments that they give are rather flimsy. I mean, they're not really specific to Schedule 3. They're just specific to marijuana, and they're a lot of them due to their imagination, really running with the ball. Hypothetical examples and things run to their greatest possible final end. And then what do they recommend in alternative? Schedule 1, going back and staying in Schedule 1. And their general argument is that the FDA got it wrong, that they're not considering how dangerous marijuana really is. Look at this case or that case or this case or that case. And I think saying that to the FDA is kind of naive. To say that the FDA hasn't considered the cases is kind of naive. I'm not an FDA, aficionado. The FDA has really been awful to our movement. They came out with a 420 on the day 420 anti-marijuana piece years ago that I will never forgive them for. But nonetheless, the FDA is, a lot of good, hardworking people that actually put some work into, trying to figure out how to deal with vape pens for kids, or, how to deal with oxycodone and stuff like that for medical use, and get the bugs out of it so you don't encourage abuse out there in the community. So that's, they're tasked with some pretty heavy work, and they've never been in our way with Schedule 1. The folks that are really scared of Schedule 3 in our camp, that's what I would, point to about the FDA. That's one of the strongest arguments from our camp, is that Schedule 3 would, gut the industry as we know it for medical cannabis. And I just don't see that. I don't see any new enforcement regimen under Schedule 3 that's going to be any more robust than what the FDA already has available to them under Schedule 1. They have enormous resources to go after wrongdoers under Schedule 1.
Yeah.
And they do. If you make a false claim, or in some way advertise an illegal drug, or there's a lot of ways you can step on the FDA's tripwire and wind up with the FDA breathing down your neck. And ask a lot of our hemp producers, and they'll tell you.
So I know that I'd like to talk a little bit about your work with the World Health Organization. Could you briefly describe, or not so briefly, we've got an hour, exactly the process that led to the international law changing with regard to cannabis?
So as you're asking me this question, I'm running it in my brain and trying to reword it. And I actually reworded the question twice. So first, I was going to go back to the origin of this action that led to the outcome that you're talking about. But then I realized when you're talking to an audience of cannabis, folks, cannabis culture, cannabis aficionados, cannabis industry, cannabis activists, whatever hat you might wear out there that you're watching this from, you might want to know why this matters at all. Why we care, what the WHO or what the UN thinks about cannabis. And this is one of the things that drove my activism at the beginning, years and years and years ago, was discovering what our United States Constitution says about treaties. And just to summarize it, it was something like treaties, once ratified, would become the supreme law of the land. And then when I looked at these treaties, which a treaty is ratified in the United States, it's a pretty heavy thing. Like the administrative functions of the treaties are held by the executive branch. So the executive branch, the president, the Department of State, whatever, they sign into the treaties, they negotiate the treaties. But any heavy duty treaties get actually run before the Senate, and the United States Senate has to sign off on it. So that's, a pretty big process to get the administrative executive branch signed on, and then get the people essentially through the Senate to sign on to it before we would finally ratify it and say that we're a signer and sign that treaty. So that's no small thing. I think our governments over the last several administrations, 5 administrations maybe even, have made people, I think, in our world just sort of laugh off treaties because they're not respected, they're not, adhered to, they're not enforced, etc. And those all may be true, but that doesn't change the fact that inside our U.S. law, they mean a lot. And inside, if you go back in that process I talked about before, where NORML was butting heads with the DEA on scheduling, oh man, the treaty was brought up all the time against the NORML to knock it down.
I drafted a law to legalize marijuana, and we put it up for a vote finally in 2012. We lost with 47% of the vote in 2012. And that specifically, I thought, dealt with the treaty issue by conforming to their licensing and requirements that a central state agency take possession of the crop. I thought that any marijuana legalization bill that didn't do that would be overturned in the court. And obviously, that's not what's happened.
Well, this is interesting. So let me skip ahead and talk about this for a second, because what we wound up doing, we succeeded in 2020 in changing the treaty and actually removing cannabis from the, quote, most dangerous drug category of the treaty. And what that did, in essence and in reality, was open up medical marijuana around the world. There's no more real barriers to countries setting up medical marijuana systems at their national level, at the local level. And in the United States, our medical marijuana programs have been somewhat overshadowed by adult rec programs. But adult rec is very specific carve out within our Constitution, and it works within our U.S. Constitution, and it also lines up with an exemption to the treaty. So if the countries want to continue down that road and do legalization for adults only, adult rec, whatever you want to call it, they can do that. There's certain things that they have to do, reporting requirements and other things, obligations like instituting harm reduction, demand reduction, having addiction treatment and services available. Medical use has to be accessible. So yeah, I think that the countries could actually do it. I think what Canada's already doing could actually easily fit within the exemption, but they've never tried to do it. They've never tried to actually call in the exemption of the treaty and legalize their legalization. So we don't really have anybody that's made adult rec fully legal. And again, as I'm sort of making it, implying, it's different. It's under a different track. It's under an exemption of the treaty for non-medical, non-scientific use, what's called an industrial exemption. And doesn't it seem funny that our cannabis industry would neatly fit into an industrial exemption in the treaty? But it does. That's how it works. But medical is also extremely important and shouldn't be like pushed aside. Like in the United States, the way we're doing in a lot of states, the medical programs seem to be almost pushed aside. I mean, the Oregon, number of licensees has dropped so terribly low of medical cannabis growers and patients. It's terrible. It's almost to the point where it could easily be, you could foresee it disappearing. That would be a horrible outcome, because the thing that really lines up with the medical and scientific use of cannabis in the treaty is our state programs. And our federal government needs to get its, what out of its, what, to get on the program and get that working at the national level, so we can plug into that, so that our medical cannabis industry can plug into the medical cannabis world of scientific research and medical patient access throughout the globe. And we've got products here in the United States that are grown in Oregon, grown in California, grown in Florida, grown in Hawaii, grown in, the furthest reaches of Maine, that will, I guarantee you, qualify as top grade medicinal quality cannabis for a worldwide medical cannabis market. Right now, medical cannabis is being handled by like Canada and, a couple of firms in Holland and Netherlands and Germany, etc. That's a crime. That should be worldwide open, and we should be getting cannabis from near the equator. We should be getting world-class land race, blow your mind at the quality cannabis right now. That's better than anything you could grow indoors now, then, or ever. But we're not, because the countries of the world are not really getting it together, like the United States, who's still standing in the way of medical cannabis. I can talk about in advance, hopefully we'll get to talk about in advance, that is happening in the Caribbean and is a shining light for other countries to follow on medical cannabis, and hopefully will get us closer to what I'm talking about. To get back to the point at hand, I actually came to the UN in 1998. In 1998 to 2008, we were working on getting badges, believe it or not, getting our foot in the door, really understanding the lay of the land as a cannabis movement. I wrapped that work with a huge effort in 2008, is a resolution that we passed with the UN about how to work with NGOs, groups like us, non-governmental organizations. And that we put on the shelf in 2008. 2009, I showed up at the UN and sat there with my colleagues I described earlier from FAT and NCOD, and watched in a certain amount of disbelief as Japan got up on stage and said that they were going to try to outlaw cannabis seeds. And they wanted the whole UN to get behind them to stop what they called high potency cannabis seeds from destroying our youth. And they were joined by Azerbaijan. Azerbaijan and Japan put forth a seed resolution. And I swear to you, this is true. I remember it so clearly. At the time, I was sitting there with my friend Farid Gayouche. He's from Paris. And I looked at him just after Japan got off this stage and said, I think they screwed up. That was just the first thing that came to my mind, was I think they screwed up. And indeed, I think they did screw up. To shorten the story, all right, so Japan and Azerbaijan's seed resolution was passed by the UN. It did get enough votes and become a UN resolution. The UN then Secretariat had to try to figure out what this means. What it meant really was a top to bottom review of cannabis, because seeds have always been considered industrial exempt. Remember, I was talking about industrial exemption. Seeds have always been considered like the standard, the gold standard of industrial exempt was always the seed, and then the leaf, but the seed for sure. And the leaf was like an exemption that India took 100 years ago, with bhang and stuff, to protect the leaf as exempt for general use. That's always been exempt. So anyway, they being the UN, then sent this request over to the World Health Organization. The World Health Organization is written into the treaty process as the qualified body to do evidentiary review and scientific review to make determinations and recommendations on a change in schedule within the treaty. So that happened to be a place I'd been working for years already. I had actually had sit-down meetings with the leadership of the Essential Medicines Department of the WHO for years, trying to figure out how to get this going and what to do with this, essential need for cannabis as a medicine. There was a process, but it had been stalled. It's a process that's under a office. It's a committee, actually, the Committee on Drug Dependence. So it's an expert committee on drug dependence within the WHO Essential Medicines Department. And that little committee is what's tasked with making the review and the recommendations to this treaty body. And it's stalled. It wasn't going anywhere. What actually got the ball rolling, and this is ironic as hell, I guess, but it was the countries around the world, their need to be able to handle new drug substances, what's called NPS, new psychoactive substances. Think the newest version of some analog of fentanyl, or some new bath salts or something like that. This stuff is coming in hot. It's every year there's new drugs on the street, and the countries have no real means to go after this stuff. The World Health Organization was a lot more efficient than trying to get the whole UN to come up with a resolution and pass. That's a very onerous process. The process within the WHO is a streamlined, evidence-based process. They needed to get that going for convenience sake, and they did. And 2015, I attended the very first expert committee meeting that had been held in like 10 years, and the very first issue on the table was cannabis. Actually, cannabis and ketamine. Ketamine was the other one on the table, and that was interesting. A little side note: the folks that came to testify on ketamine were mostly like folks that were working with veterinarian services, and they talked about little tiny lizards and little birds and things like that, where ketamine was literally the only substance on earth that they could use to help work on a bird or something like that for surgery. I thought that was fascinating. You learn a lot, when you do cannabis activism. So we actually work within the World Health Organization process. Again, I said we had all those organizations. At one point, I think we brought in 200 signers to a particular document that we were working on. Every year, the challenge changed. 2018, we worked through that process within the WHO, brought it over to the UN. 2019, had to work through sort of a lobbying effort, if you will, to get the countries we needed to sign on and say yes to this, so that the recommendation from the WHO would become law. And we did in 2020 get enough votes. 43 countries, I think it had to be, we had to win out of the 53 to get the high threshold that we needed to pass this into policy. The WHO actually made other recommendations that were very bold that weren't acted on by the UN. I could talk about those as well, but I think it's interesting that what you'd have to say was the most bold, recommendation of all was the one that was accepted, because removing cannabis from Schedule 4 of the treaty, while it's still technically under control in the treaty, it's still written into the treaty in the way the articles are written and stuff. Cannabis and poppy and coca are written into the treaty. That's going to be difficult. That was one of the recommendations of the WHO, was that the UN rewrite the treaty, because they came back and they said, we would like to pull cannabis out of Schedule 1 of the treaty as well. In other words, deschedule cannabis, you might say. And they said they can't, because it's written into the treaty. It's what's called a pillar drug of the treaty, coca, poppy, and cannabis. So, a little side note, and I think this is important to mention. This is a perfect place to mention this, so indulge me. We as a grassroots movement really brought all hands on deck. I mean, we had folks from all over the planet testifying. We brought in every scientific voice. We brought in everybody that was working on medical cannabis, whether it was a little tiny producer in a little town somewhere in the world, or it was biggest pharmaceutical companies on earth. They all were brought in by us. We brought them in. But at the same time, we didn't have everybody working with us. Like the brass tops, if you will, the thought leaders of our cannabis reform movement, our drug policy reform movement, folks like International Drug Policy Consortium, the Transnational Institute out of Amsterdam, others. While we were working with the WHO, trying to get the recommendations passed, and very, very celebratory of the recommendations, they were condemning them. They were saying that, of course, cannabis had to be removed from Schedule 1. They said that the WHO not removing cannabis from Schedule 1 was political, that the WHO was acting too politically to not just do it and remove cannabis from Schedule 1. They should just do it. I'm paraphrasing, of course, obviously their position, but that was essentially Transnational Institute's position, which was contrary to the WHO, which was contrary to the outcome, which was fantastic. Removing cannabis from Schedule 4 was a good thing, and it opens the door to both adult rec and medical all over the world, and I can explain how. It was a good thing. And having Transnational Institute on the other side of the table while we're trying to coach the WHO and how to respond, was not where I felt like we should have been. And the reason why I bring this up is because if we were all on the same page, Transnational Institute and us, we were working together, grassroots, grass tops, we could have hit the ground running with an effort to rewrite the treaty with the WHO's blessing. The WHO just said we need to rewrite the treaty. Why didn't we run with that? Why didn't we start doing that? And we have a plan. When I say we, the grassroots cannabis movement under the leadership of little tiny organizations like Cannabis Embassy, the which is ostensibly possibly could be very big, but at the moment it's very small. We're working with an organization called Fields of Green for All in South Africa. It's the only organization at the UN with accreditation that's a cannabis-only organization that actually, by accreditation, means that they can enter into the UN and go to all these meetings and participate in these things. We're doing it. We're representing the grassroots on Earth cannabis movement with almost no money, almost no grass top support. And anything I would say in support of and congratulations to Transnational Institute on their great work in St. Thomas and the Grenadines, St. Vincent and the Grenadines. It would be tempered with that, that we've, instead of working together and doing great things together, which I think at this point we could already be working on dates for an international conference for a new treaty. I think we could, with our pressure on the right pressure points, getting the right countries to support the effort and getting the language moving, we could be well underway to rewriting a treaty. Under grassroots only support, and with the grassroots only really doing this, we're looking at like 2030 to just launch the idea. That's what we're doing. We're looking at descheduling, if you will, descheduling cannabis from the international treaty system in 2030, for that to actually become a thing, where we start talking about dates of a conference. When I say dates of a conference, these countries need to come together and write the thing. We non-governmental organizations can instigate, but the countries themselves have to get together and write the thing, and that takes time. That takes effort. It takes some special meetings, special funding. Nobody's funded right now. You go to the UN, that's the number one chorus you hear is lack of funding from every quarter, whether it's non-governmental or governmental. So even doing something is, I would have thought early on, and maybe you had the same misnomer, but you would think that legalizing is just scratching something out. No, you have to actually pass a new law to get rid of the old law is how it's done. So it's at the state level or the federal level or at the international level, it's onerous, to say the least, to change the law. We're going to have to rewrite the treaty and do it right. Figure out how to handle the pharmaceutical sector's dangerous substances that they create and keep them out of public hands. That was, I think, the key of the treaty to begin with, was how to protect the pharmaceutical sector, drugs from escape, how to keep them from getting diverted and stuff. It was never really meant to be a social control tool over what you can grow in your yard, I assure you.
So the international treaties changed in 2018 to allow cannabis, but how many nations I know the Chinese and the Russians opposed it, but the United States helped push it through, along with the European Union. What is the process now in terms of making that next step? Do you think the governments have to come together to rewrite these treaties?
Not for us, not for the cannabis movement. I mean, think about it. If medical is basically okay, we're okay with the way it is. You got countries like St. Vincent and the Grenadines where they're saying, hey, if you're a tourist and use medical cannabis, you come to our territory and you're safe to use your cannabis. We'll make it easy for you to access cannabis if you need some while you're here. That's the way it should be everywhere.
I know you wanted to. So if I flew down to the what is it? What country is that?
I'm terrible with geography, so it's St. Vincent and the Grenadines.
St. Vincent and the Grenadines. So these are a couple little island systems that form one nation. And
well, it's the briefing that we reports and work that was done, based in St. Vincent and the Grenadines, but they're working with 6 different territories, 6 different countries, all in the Caribbean area, if you will, that are working as as sort of an area of intense progress on medical cannabis, and they want to be a source material source for medical cannabis around the world. They want to be a place to come and discuss and understand and advance the science of cannabis as medicine. And they want to support, most interestingly, I think, to our team, they wanted to support the local growers and what we call the traditional what we're calling our legacy growers, that have grown through the prohibition. They're supporting them, not only supporting them, but they're requiring the legal commerce of medical cannabis to include a certain percentage of their locally grown produce.
So if I go to St. Vincent and the Grenadines, will I be able to buy locally grown cannabis as a medical patient?
Yes. And from what I understand, the process is not, very hard if you just go there and go see a doctor and do all that. But they're also respecting your card. So if you get an Oregon card, there's, your newest reason to get an Oregon card, if you're debating keeping it out there, is that you can go to St. Vincent and just be able to drop down your Oregon card and your passport and say, I'm here. So I think it's
why you got to pay them $50 to get a tourist card if you have an out-of-state card.
So, in short, and I think the most important part is the most obscure, so I'll say it first. All that stuff I was saying about adult recreational access, adult rec, legal, what we're calling legalization, being okay and well within the treaty's exemptions. If we had not removed cannabis from Schedule 4, you could just throw out everything I just said. It wouldn't apply. The only reason any of that applies is because we removed cannabis from Schedule 4. Schedule 4 of the treaty said, basically, be careful with this. It's like kryptonite. It's very dangerous. We don't know anything about it. Act accordingly is what basically Schedule 4 said. So getting rid of it
today, people knew that it wasn't deadly by the 1950s when that first was propagated.
Of course. But now, as a matter of national policy, you're supported in an international community in making medical cannabis access a reality. Not only are you supported, but that's the whole real emphasis of this treaty system. I mean, it starts out right in the very preamble of the treaty talking about how indispensable drugs are for the relief of human suffering and how the countries need to get together and sign this treaty to effectuate their access. I mean, that's the principal driving engine of the treaty system. So your question was how many countries have changed? I don't even have a tally. I lost track at like 25. There's like 40 something maybe countries that have changed their policy. St. Vincent and the Grenadines, give them credit. They changed their policy when the WHO changed its position. Like you said, in 2018, 2020 is when the treaty change happened. And if you look at the timeline, you'll see dozens of countries have changed their national cannabis laws since 2020. Dozens.
Well, thank goodness for that. We're down to about 10 minutes left to go here. What other important issues would you like to address, Michael?
Well, last year, right about this time, I attended a treaty, the birth of a new treaty. And it wasn't on my, dance card, if you will, when I started as a cannabis activist to be doing stuff like this. But here I am. I was at the World Intellectual Property Organization, not the UN, but but the UN World Intellectual Property Organization. And in that system, which goes back to things like the Convention on Biological Diversity and, pacts that were signed in Madrid and Lisbon and whatever, all to protect genetic resources and to protect, national treasures like, the land races and the products we were talking about before, the appellations. The cannabis appellation is based loosely on the appellations of old, the Roquefort cheese and champagne. These are true appellations where the thing that you're talking about is from a place, a certain place. The dirt, the air, the people's knowledge of how to grow it. Something in that mix comes up with something unique, and it's provable that it's unique. That's how you're given that appellation, is that uniqueness is provable. That's a big one. And at that treaty level, we got a new treaty last year called GRATK, GRATK. The Genetic Resources and Associated Traditional Knowledge Treaty. And that treaty, for the first time, really recognized what I was just talking about, that knowledge base, the community around the growing, that somehow has evolved in a way that has certain special knowledge to produce the products that come from that region. It's as special as the dirt and the water and the air, that knowledge base. And it was recognized by the treaty system in last year with that new treaty. And what this is all leading to, for me, is somewhat of a revolution backwards, going, forwards and backwards. We, in the cannabis world, if you go back to around 1890, there were no national laws against cannabis. There was no efforts to outlaw cannabis. There was some talk in France about what we call reefer madness, which is a disproven medical claim. That's where it came from, 1700s in France. But it wasn't really manifested in any real law at the time. Cannabis was open. You could get it in the Sears and Roebuck catalog. You could get it through the mail. You can get fine Indian cannabis, fine African cannabis through the mail. And at that time, there were products distinguished by their place. Cannabis africanus, Cannabis americana, Cannabis indica. These were designations registering the place of that source material, because the source material was wildly different based on the place that you got it from. That's where we need to get back to. Now, it's not to say that we won't have big industry and big corporate powers that come out with the Marlboro of cannabis, and I bless them, because they should bless us. Because our little tiny growers and these little tiny communities that produce these niche products that are so good quality that are going to have people like me and you probably seeking them out, are tiny market share. They're not getting in the way of the big corporate powers, number one. And number two, they are very sustainable with that little market share. Is a lot of money, and they can sustain themselves quite well with that. And they will produce the next big thing, the next big revolution, the next big evolution in genetics, or some a special quality of the plant, of the products, will come from these. That's what we know from experience. It's not going to come from these big corporate powers. The big corporate powers run shit into the ground that we produce. So let us produce some more stuff so you can have more shit to run into the ground. We'll all be happy. I am not against people going and buying a Budweiser of weed, or the big company that produces the Budweiser of weed, as long as my little grower somewhere on the equator can bust out of their colonial power restraints and have a really nice little niche business of 5 or 10% of the market share, where they can own an enormous amount of money and power, because 5 or 10% of the world is not a small thing. And I think that it's faith maybe on my behalf, but these are transcendent products. These are cannabis products that are better than anything you've ever tried, if all you've ever had was stuff grown indoors under lights from a dispensary system. This is outside of that range of possibility. What our friend Robert Connell Clark calls above the genetic ceiling that exists with indoor growing and cultivation. This is powerful, beautiful, forward-leaning, sustainable agriculture stuff that I'm getting into. But I agree, and I understand the nicheness of it, the smallness of it, and I embrace that. I actually embrace that. But we do need some help. I mean, working with small growers and producers around the world is not easy when you have no funding at all. And the work, like I said, Transnational Institute and others that did in the Caribbean, where they got the governments to buy in on 10%, that's great. 10% of the local crop, 10% from those indigenous peoples, those what we're calling legacy growers, that's great. But man, 10%? What's 10%? I went to HempFest one time with 10% coupons that this company gave me, and nobody wanted them. 10% wasn't enough of a discount to get the attention of cannabis consumers at HempFest, because they're used to buying a bong that's retail $500 for $250. They're not used to 10%. So I don't think 10% is enough. But I also don't think we should be mandating a growing system to have to do things that might destroy them. So I'm coming up with a plan. I think BAC will wind up carrying this plan that essentially comes up with a graded system where you use tools that are at the disposal of the federal governments. Things like national tourism, things like tax rates and rebates, things like that. So let's say you're a dispensary system in the Caribbean and you want to get up to 70% support of locally grown, locally harvested Rastafari cannabis. You're going to be able to be on national TV with the the leadership of your government a couple of times a year. You're going to get some real payback for your participation and your support of the local growing community. It's not going to be a matter of finding people. It's a matter of giving them reward. If you drop under 10%, I guess you get a fine. But if you get 50, 60, 70, 80%, you should get national recognition, international recognition, spotlight. And the tourism angle is something that we are just now beginning to explore. Veterans Action Council brought a fellow on a roundtable a while back, Brian Applegarth, who's a pioneer in cannabis tourism. We're talking about tourism with the specific interest or focal point of the history and the science and the illustrious community and culture of cannabis. And it's fascinating stuff that is legit. It's working, government.
You said you brought in this Appleford. Was that his name?
Brian Applegarth. Brian Applegarth would be best known for his work with the California State Fair and the historical work that he's done on what's called a cannabis historical walk, I think they call it in California.
I see. Well, we're about out of time here. We've only got a minute or two left, Michael. What would you like to say in closing? If somebody wanted to reach out to you to support the Veterans Action Council or the Cannabis Embassy, what's the best way to go about that?
The Cannabis Embassy is online. You go to Cannabis Embassy website, just look it up. It's pretty easy to find. A lot of interesting stuff to read, a lot of documentation. Veterans Action Council is a absolute voluntary effort with no leadership, nothing. We work on consensus projects, but we do work on funded projects. We just work with a funding, registered, funding designee, and that would be DRC Net Foundation right now. I think would be the best if you wanted to send a donation or in some way help the Veterans Action Council. You could also earmark the funds for the cannabis work that we do at the UN, which will be supportive of the Cannabis Embassy as well through DRC Net Foundation. And it's stopthedrugwar.org or drcnet.org, I believe. I hope I'm saying that right.
David Borden still involved with that?
David Borden is executive director.
Cool.
Yeah, and David, just a quick note on that. About 10 years ago, David and DRCNet brought over some leadership from Thailand, actual senator from Thailand that was protesting the murder in the streets of drug users. And she came to the UN and spoke and was quickly arrested on her return to Thailand. I mean, I'm saying Thailand. I should be saying Philippines, from the Philippines. And she was immediately arrested upon her return to the Philippines. And this last year, just in the last few months, that is completely reversed. That senator is now back in position of authority and respect in the Philippines. And the actual president, Duterte, he is the one who's now been arrested just recently.
Well, thank you for coming on, Michael.
Wow.
We are out of time. Michael Krawitz with all those different organizations. Thanks for all the breaking news and history lesson here. I look forward to having you back in the near future. Keep working to restore hemp.
Thanks, man. Anytime.